What's the most F-up thing you've seen at work? Story 1. I was sorting all the psychiatric patients that were hospitalized in my state, and I came across this guy, a teenager, or maybe a bit older. He had been sent to the ward because he suddenly became aggressive and started experiencing episodes where he squirmed in pain, took off his clothes, and displayed other unusual behaviors. Before being hospitalized, he had been complaining about these symptoms, but nothing the doctors tried was effective, and no physical issues were found. It seemed to be a psychiatric problem, right? Or wrong. He ended up in the ward for about 2 years, losing a significant portion of his life while being considered insane. It turned out he had developed a rare spinal cancer that was difficult to detect, causing him extreme pain. It was really unfortunate. I don't recall what happened to him afterward, but I'm not very optimistic that it had a happy ending. Story 2. I worked at one of the busiest Walmarts in the country during spring break for 6 years. I wouldn't even know where to start. One incident that stands out is of a drunk woman who left the bathroom with her pants around her ankles, all while relieving herself as she walked across the front of the building and then exited outside. None of the workers wanted to deal with it, so they placed shopping carts over each mess until the cleaning crew arrived. Story 3. I worked at a call center and was in the break area on the second floor when I overheard a man arguing with his soon-to-be ex-wife. I walked back to my call area, and about 30 seconds later, the whole call center went into lockdown. It turned out that the man had decided to end his life by jumping headfirst onto the concrete floor, landing right in front of my coworker. The coworker was granted unlimited paid days off and therapy for the rest of the year. Story 4. I worked at a Nissan dealership where many of the salespeople had questionable ethics. One day, an elderly man wearing a veteran's cap was working on a deal for a car for his grandchild. The kind old man grew tired and fell asleep in the chair while waiting for the salesperson to negotiate with the sales managers. At one point, a manager from the bullpen walked by, passed gas in the sleeping man's face, and then ran back to the bullpen, where everyone was laughing. It was appalling. I informed a salesperson who was a veteran himself about what had happened. He stormed into the bullpen and shouted at each one of those individuals. He was so furious that I thought he might collapse. Story 5. I worked as a veterinary technician at a clinic in a lower-income area, which unfortunately meant that many of the animals we saw were not properly cared for, whether intentionally or not. One particular dog, no older than 2 years, looked as though she was 15 years old due to the damage she had endured. The poor dog had been declawed, but it was a botched job, causing her obvious pain while walking. She was missing an eye, with the owner claiming she got a stick in it, a claim I doubted. The dog's neck showed clear signs of prolonged, tight chaining with visible red welts. However, none of these issues were the primary problem. The owner, a middle-aged man, appeared indifferent about the dog's suffering. He only brought her in because his wife complained about her barking and terrible smell. When we examined the dog, we found an oozing wound on her shoulder. After shaving her, we discovered that her entire side was covered in red, infected skin. It was later revealed that she had been shot with buckshot, which had caused a severe infection. She was beyond saving. The owner refused to pay for treatment and said he would handle it at home. I then overheard him on the phone saying he intended to use her for target practice, an appalling statement. I informed my veterinarian, who was already horrified and considering calling animal control. We decided to tell the owner that the dog had passed away. He left, and knowing there was no hope for her recovery, we provided food and pain medication before humanely putting her to sleep. Story 6. A patient came into the ER and underwent a full sepsis workup. His blood chemistry was severely abnormal, requiring a manual white cell count because the automated analyzer couldn't handle it. His urine was loaded with white cells and bacteria. It seemed like a classic case of old person UTI gone septic, so we figured he'd be admitted. Instead, they sent him home. This wasn't a case of patient left AMA against medical advice. The doctor simply said, "You've got a UTI. Go home and drink some cranberry juice." 2 days later, the same patient returned with the same symptoms and underwent the same tests. While I was manually counting his white cells, the phone rang. It was the reference lab down the street. The blood cultures from the patient's previous visit had come back positive. I relayed the information to the ER, expecting him to be admitted this time. But to our surprise, they sent him home again. Again, not an AMA, just a go home and drink some cranberry juice. Story 7. I worked in search and rescue nearly 10 years ago. We entered a building in an area that had recently been heavily shelled. The lower apartments were completely destroyed, while the upper floors appeared relatively intact inside. However, there were massive cracks in the walls and floors, and every surface released a cloud of dust when touched. There was no power, the plumbing was ruined with leaks everywhere, and the people inside needed to be moved to safety. We heard screaming from what seemed like the third floor, but as we moved up, the sound faded into a faint wailing. We eventually found the apartment it was coming from, and inside was a child, around 6, 7 years old, crouching under a table with hands over his ears, surrounded by blood splatters. As we turned the corner into the kitchen, we found the mother slumped on the floor, weakly sobbing. Both of her hands had been severed and were lying next to her. She was trying to press her bleeding stumps into bed sheets. Her injuries weren't from the conflict, but were allegedly inflicted by her husband, who had found evidence of infidelity and attacked her in rage before fleeing. He was reportedly involved with local extremist groups and abandoned her as the city's situation deteriorated. Story 8. While not exactly a close coworker, one of the associates I knew collapsed at an airport due to dehydration and fatigue after working over 100 hours in investment banking. That was when I knew I had to leave. He was working on 3 live transactions amid a record number of associate resignations. He had been promised a promotion and a big bonus if he could handle it all. My experience was similar. In my first year as an analyst, I worked 80, 90 hours a week for 2 weeks straight to close a deal. We went out for drinks after the deal closed. I got quite drunk due to sleep deprivation and not eating properly. My mom called during my Uber ride home, and I broke down crying uncontrollably. I was living far from home, with no friends or support system, and I was utterly exhausted. For those curious, investment bankers in M&A are essentially real estate brokers for selling businesses. This involves intensive financial modeling to predict the company's potential worth in 3-5 years, along with creating marketing reports, CIMs, that can be 75, 100 pages long. The workload itself isn't extremely complex, but juniors have no control over when seniors assign tasks. If a director or VP calls at 2 a.m. for updates on a 9 a.m. presentation, you have to deliver. Story 9. I used to clear out apartments after tenants abandoned them or were evicted. One of the apartments belonged to a woman with severe schizophrenia. The trash in every room was thigh-high. The worst room was the bathroom. Her toilet had broken at some point, but she continued to use it. There was a solidified pile of waste nearly a foot above the bowl, with an inch-thick layer of dried waste covering the floor. The smell was the most repulsive thing I've ever encountered. Story 10. This might not be as dramatic, but I worked at a large bank where I dealt with a sweet old lady who had been hospitalized after breaking her hip and battling an infection. During her absence, her autopay bills overdrew her account repeatedly, accumulating fees. When she finally reached me, she had over $635 in fees and a negative balance. Let's call her Grace. Grace, a retired teacher of 45 years with a small lifetime savings of just over $100K, was desperate for help. I managed to refund about $200, but needed my manager's approval for more. His first question was, "How much does she have with us?" I told him, "Just over $100K. He sighed and refused additional refunds, stating her balance didn't justify it. I was livid. I told Grace that if she could cover the negative balance, I'd work on getting the rest of her money back. A coworker and I then used our monthly fee quotas to gradually refund all her fees. When I called her back, she was elated and thanked me profusely. A few weeks later, my coworker and I were called into a meeting by security. We were fired for attendance violations for being a few minutes late from breaks, which began shortly after we helped Grace. I'm certain the time logs were manipulated, but I had no recourse. Story 11. I worked at a small-town pizza place in the southern U.S. 2 coworkers stood out. One was a redneck kid who always did his job, but was quite racist and arrogant, while the other was a black kid, also a good worker, who was more of a team player and took responsibility for his mistakes. They knew each other from high school and were about the same age. One night while messing around, the redneck kid called the other a slave as an insult. He then slapped him with a wet cleaning rag, and the black kid lightly hit him back. The redneck kid started crying and stepped outside to call his dad. His father made him quit his job and showed up at the store, threatening my manager and demanding that his son be kept away from the other kid, using a racial slur. The situation escalated to the point where the police had to intervene and issue a restraining order against the man. Story 12. I worked as a CNA in a large nursing home, filling in on a floor I wasn't familiar with. I was going about my tasks, assisting patients who were unable to speak or move independently. While cleaning one elderly woman, I noticed an unusual lack of pubic hair and reddened skin around her genital area. I assumed it was due to a medical condition. About an hour later, the head nurse called me and two other aides into an office asking if we had noticed anything odd with the residents. One of the aides mentioned two women with similar redness, and I brought up what I had observed. As it turned out, a male CNA on that floor had been sexually abusing patients. We all provided statements to the police, and he was fired. I don't know what happened afterward, as I soon left for a job closer to home. Story 13. When I was 17 or 18, I worked the overnight shift at a Jack in the Box on 16th Street and Van Buren in Phoenix, Arizona, back in the late 80s. If you're familiar with the area, you know how rough it was back then. One night, during the usual rush of drunk customers, two black men were waiting in the drive-through line. Their wait time was normal, and they seemed calm, but the Hispanic man behind them was impatient and honking his horn. At some point, his car rolled forward and lightly bumped the new-looking car in front of him. The two men got out, leaned into his vehicle, and began beating him severely. The man inside was tossed around like a pinball. After the assault, the two men returned to their car, collected their food, and left without a word. The Hispanic man, visibly bruised and disoriented, drove up to the window. A young worker who was off duty but hanging around approached him and demanded $20, which the man handed over. Then the shift manager asked for $20 as well. The man complied. The manager offered me $20 too, but I declined, not wanting to make the situation worse. The manager then tossed some frozen tacos into a bag and threw them onto the man's lap, yelling for him to leave. As he drove away, I noticed his car had a handicapped license plate. Story 14. When I was 18, fresh out of high school, I worked at a lumber yard. One day I was leaving the break room when a male coworker came up the stairs, exposing himself. He pushed me down and tried to pull my pants down. I fought back, kicking and scratching until I managed to escape. I ran to the front counter, my shirt ripped open and pants halfway on, and reported the incident to the store manager. His response was, "What do you expect? You work at a lumber yard." I quit immediately, and nothing was done about the man. Later, the same manager was accused of sexual coercion and assault by two other female employees. I never reported my incident, unsure of my worth or the proper steps to take. It was 30 years ago, and I was just trying to avoid conflict. 3 years later, the same man's brother was arrested for rape and murder of a local woman. It seems cruelty ran in the family. Story 15. I used to work as a customer service agent for a clothing company that targeted classy European millennials. My job primarily involved handling returns, missing items, and shipping delays via chat. We also had a phone line for customers who preferred calls. One day, I picked up a chat request. The customer had contacted us multiple times before, requesting urgent assistance and sharing several images. I opened the images to see what was so urgent, only to find a bizarre collection of foot fetish photos, some of which were explicit. The customer was apparently a known creep who had been sending such images for a while. It was my first month on the job, so I was shocked, but my coworkers were unfazed. I quickly learned that working in a call center toughens you up. Another strange incident involved a customer who received a wrong item after ordering a summer dress online. Instead, she received urine samples, fully packed in our branded box. I had no explanation for her, though I privately suspected it might have been the result of a warehouse worker reaching a breaking point. I advised her to dispose of it immediately. The funniest part? The woman asked if she could swap the samples for the correct item at a physical store. Story 16. Young guy came into the ED with his hand in a cooler, saying his friends jokingly pushed him into the campfire and he fell hand first into the coals. They drove an hour and a half to the ED. When he pulled his hand out, the skin and muscle tissue had sloughed off, dangling from what was mostly just bone. He asked how long it would take to heal. I told him I'd try to keep him comfortable and gave him as much medication as I could safely provide. A 19-year-old victim of domestic violence came in with multiple stab wounds. We intubated her through one of them, but she didn't survive due to over 30 stab wounds and blood loss. There was a motorcycle accident victim who wore a helmet but not one with a jaw protector. His face was severely injured, and we had to intubate him by following air bubbles. His mouth was filled with blood and broken teeth. He coughed, and a tooth hit my cheek. A ruptured globe eyeball injury isn't unusual, but eye trauma always makes my skin crawl. The chemical burns causing blindness remind me of certain Black Mirror episodes, which I can't watch. A mass trauma event brought in several conscious patients with detached limbs. They were in shock, holding their detached body parts. A mentally ill woman arrived after a wellness check, post-mastectomy. We uncovered her chest and saw black necrosis, which then turned to green as fleas and bugs jumped from the wound. EMS noted she had many cats. A diabetic man in a scooter hadn't seen his legs in a while. He thought he saw a bug, so he bagged his leg and came in. In triage, I opened the bag and maggots poured out of his lower leg. A paraplegic nursing home patient was technically sane, but refused care. His bed sore revealed his pelvis, sacrum, and upper femur. He was on chronic antibiotics. We also had an obese, psychotic man in sepsis. Pulling back his abdominal fold revealed gangrene. His genitals were buried in tissue, and when pressed to find the urethra for a catheter, what appeared was mush. The worst cases I've seen involve abused children, but I won't share those horrors. Be kind to kids and teach them to be kind to others, especially the weird or different ones. Story 17. Working at a marina in college, I saw a boat from the club speeding into the dock, with people shouting. As it hit the dock, I saw people pressing towels on a man at the bow, with blood everywhere. The man had been pulled into the propeller after the driver mistakenly reversed while he was holding onto a tube rope. He was sliced from ankle to abdomen. The ambulance arrived, and as they got him onto the gurney, his body was severely injured, with organs exposed. I later heard he survived, but recovery was long and he was never the same. Another incident was when an old cabin cruiser exploded, throwing people into the water. The boat had just refueled and the captain tried to restart the engine, igniting fumes in the bilge. Always use the blower, folks. Story 18. My story is pretty lame. I was paid to feed the neighbor's pets while she was away. When I went to clean the litter boxes, I saw a naked man and woman in the bedroom. I backed out, leaving my flip-flops in the hallway. I returned with my mom and a policeman arrived with my flip-flops. The man was the owner's brother, using her house to cheat on his wife. He said he'd handle the pets and took my key. After the family returned, I explained what happened. The brother's lies were exposed, leading to a divorce, job loss, and even an attempt to harm me. Story 19. A woman came into the emergency room, a heroin addict. She had abscesses on both arms the size of baseballs. Both arms were bruised, red, and mottled, similar to what you see when there's no more blood flow after death. She still had pulses in the arms, so circulation was present. But they looked swollen like Michelin man arms, oozing purulent bloody drainage with a smell like a rotting animal mixed with stale food. She was in severe pain, but her tolerance for narcotics meant pain control was nearly impossible. She cried and screamed constantly, shaking and passing out, only to wake up and repeat the cycle. Surgeons finally decided to take her to the operating room, possibly to amputate one or both arms, but she refused. So they had to settle for draining, cleaning, and debriding the abscesses. I thought that was the end, as I work in the ER and rarely see the outcomes. But no, she returned a week and a half later with the same issue. This time, both arms were essentially degloved, meaning the skin and tissue on the surface were gone, leaving exposed muscle, tendons, and skeletal hands. It wasn't a full degloving, but huge chunks of tissue were missing. She looked like a zombie. They planned to admit her and start IV antibiotics, but she snuck out of the hospital to get high, leaving her IV in place. The IV was a central line in her chest, but it got blocked and stopped working. She left it hanging, partially pulled out, taped messily to her chest with Scotch tape. Meanwhile, she had neglected her damaged arms, which required dressing changes 4 times a day. She started injecting into them again, leading to even more abscesses. Once again, she was crying and screaming. This time, she held her arms in the air, fluid dripping over her shoulders onto the sheets. Every time I entered the room, she was like a moaning figure buried in hospital linens. It was the most horrifying and saddest case I've seen. I tried to help, but I will never forget her cries and the irreparable damage she did to herself in pursuit of her addiction. Story 20. An elderly man with severe mental health issues, whose body had collapsed from years of drug abuse, was on our psych unit. He had a catheter bag physically attached to his walker. This detail is important. This man had faced hardship his entire life, especially post-Vietnam, enduring abuse and neglect from the American healthcare system. One day, someone bought him a 20 ounces Diet Pepsi, and he sat down to enjoy it in the common space. A nursing aide then told him, "John Doe, You can drink here, but watch your mouth. Anyone familiar with high-stress environments knows that this escalated the situation. The man, a grown adult minding his business, didn't respond well to this provocation. He fired back with a string of colorful insults, further escalating the situation. A nurse approached, standing with hands on hips in a combative posture. Instead of asking what happened, she assumed he was at fault and ordered him to his room. This was not only unfair but would also cause him significant discomfort due to his health issues. He refused and threw the bottle cap at her. The staff then attempted to restrain him. At this point, the nursing aide and another nurse intervened, slamming the 74-year-old man to the ground and dragging him to his room. They didn't think to grab his walker, which had the catheter attached. After about 3 feet, the catheter line pulled tight, yanking the walker along and tearing his skin. The force caused severe damage, tearing his catheter and causing him to bleed heavily. I stepped in and yelled for them to stop while grabbing his walker. They surprisingly came to their senses, allowing him to stand, and I helped him back to his room. I was so appalled that I reported the incident to HR. Coincidentally, the hospital was undergoing recertification that week, and the matter was escalated to the head of nursing. However, nothing changed. Everyone blamed the man and stood together rather than admitting fault. I was shunned by the staff and eventually left 6 months later. Story 21. I used to work for an art studio that created illustrations for medical litigation, so I've seen some really disturbing stuff. We would always receive photos, security footage, etc. If it was evidence in a lawsuit, we got it. We saw plenty of severed body parts, gunshot wounds to the face, police brutality, animal attacks, and more. One case involved a driver speeding at night who drove under a semi-trailer he didn't see. The roof of his car peeled back like a can lid being opened, and his head was caught in the part that came off with the lid. But the absolute worst I ever saw. A kid was riding in a car on the highway without a seatbelt. The car hit one of those median cut-throughs, going from 70 to 0 in less than a second. He was ejected into oncoming traffic and went under a large truck. I'm not sure if it was a semi, dump truck, or tow truck. The only way to describe it is like squeezing a tube of toothpaste from the bottom, with the top half of his head as the cap. Story 22. This story might not align with the rest, but as a drone operator inspecting sewer lines, I have a real horror story that nearly caused a mass casualty event. My coworker and I parked the van near a manhole in a quiet Florida city. We prepared the 80-pound drone and cables, then opened the manhole. Initial inspection showed a bit of dirt, mostly sand and non-fecal sediment. Sewer systems are designed so that biological waste doesn't stick around, but sediment like sand is common in Florida. The drone's wheels are metal, engineered to act like abrasive sandpaper. They're sharp enough to cut you and cost a lot, around $70 KA for the entire setup. To move the drone forward, we need traction from the wheels, which also have to pull the heavy cable. Typically, we're lucky to reach 300 feet before resetting at another manhole. We spent 30 minutes on this run before the drone got stuck. We decided to reverse it and hit record, but the drone wasn't moving easily, so we started yanking the cable forcefully. It finally moved about 3 feet, and we saw something alarming, a layer resembling thick, flaky snow. Crystals. In a sewer, this means only one thing: H2S gas. H2S gas is odorless, colorless, and can build up in rotting environments like sewers. It's flammable, corrosive, and one of the deadliest gases. At low levels, it's undetectable until it's too late, as it stops you from taking another breath. At higher concentrations, 50, 1000 ppm, it smells like rotten eggs. At around 20,000 ppm, it crystallizes. What happened next was chaos. Police, hazmat teams, federal agents, and the evacuation of a square mile followed. We had to instruct federal agents via walkie-talkies to extract our equipment, as we weren't allowed near the site again. We narrowly escaped, and a city block was at risk. The grinding wheels and that flammable material and our disturbance of the H2S gas, possibly built up over years under sediment, could have been catastrophic. Story 23. There was this girl at my serving job who had a clear drug addiction. She was nice, but often showed up late or called out randomly. The manager decided to fire her, but also called in her server friends on their day off to witness the firing in front of the restaurant and all the guests. Sure, firing her was necessary, but making a show of it when she was clearly struggling with addiction was just cruel. At my corporate job, they would email people to meet in the break room and fire them as a group. One of my teammates was on lunch when they sent the email and didn't see it until he got back. When he asked what it was about, the manager, knowing he was getting fired, told him not to worry about it. So he continued working for the rest of the day, unaware. Story 24. I used to work at a local pizza chain in New England. I had managed several locations, mostly in Rhode Island. I was working in Warren, Rhode Island, with the general manager, GM, a shift leader, and 2 other employees. It was a slow day, and we were cleaning up for the dinner rush. The GM was breaking down boxes with a folding utility knife that had a new razor. He wasn't paying attention. While I was cleaning the dining area, I heard a loud scream and saw the GM clutching his right arm. He had accidentally cut from the lower left of his elbow to the bottom right of his wrist. Blood was pouring from his arm, exposing muscle and tendon. I grabbed his arm, held it over a trash bin, and wrapped paper towels to try to stop the bleeding. I instructed an employee to call 911 and lock the store to prevent customers from entering. One employee, who wasn't panicking, cut up an apron to make a tourniquet. Paramedics arrived 2 minutes later, but it felt like forever. The GM lost a pint or 2 of blood and ended up with a nasty scar. What stuck with me was the feeling of dried blood on my hands and having to wash it off before returning to work like it was just another day. Story 25. I once worked as a newborn photographer at 19 for a company contracted with hospitals. We offered free in-house sessions to new mothers, then edited the photos and provided same-day access to the galleries. If they wanted to keep the photos, they had to purchase packages. During training, I learned how to swaddle, pose, and calm the babies, along with handling special circumstances like NICU cases. The lesser-known service was photographing demises. Unlike regular sessions, these were free for grieving mothers who wanted to keep the photos. On my last day of training, I was given a pamphlet outlining basic guidelines for handling these situations. I was told these shoots rarely happened, and mothers usually didn't want to be disturbed. My first solo day was a demise. I can't imagine the mother's pain, having never given birth myself. But as a photographer, taking pictures of a deceased newborn while witnessing the mother's heartbreak was incredibly tough. I never discuss it, as it was one of the most heartbreaking experiences I've had. I won't go into detail, but I'll never forget the sight of that baby and the broken mother. Story 26. I worked at a McDonald's in 2022. I was on my 30-minute meal break, sitting in the back corner. After finishing my break, I clocked back in and returned to the front counter to find 5 police officers detaining a new cashier. The cashier, a young Korean man who looked a lot like Psy, the Gangnam-style rapper, was being handcuffed. He had been working in the lobby while I was on break and apparently threatened a customer over rude comments about poorly made food. He didn't make the food, he just handed over the bag, but he overreacted, followed the customer outside, got in his face, and scraped the customer's car with a pocket knife. The customer called the police, leading to his arrest. The police asked for statements, but most employees hadn't seen anything due to the divider wall separating the counter from the kitchen. I told them I was on lunch, but suggested they speak with a woman sitting in the booth near the front door. She'd been there for at least 2 hours, but seemed to have a few screws loose, often struggling to form coherent sentences. The officers thanked me for the caution. After speaking with her, they ended up kicking her out of the restaurant due to her combative behavior. She claimed McDonald's workers wanted her to burn in hell and blamed her diabetes for growing gray hairs on her feet and nose. Story 27. A guy working for me was repeatedly written up for PPE violations, like not wearing safety glasses or a face shield. He was also written up several times for removing the disc guard on angle grinders. Eventually, it caught up to him. A thin, cut-off grinding wheel exploded, and a 2-inch triangular remnant shot into his left eye, embedding deeply. He was airlifted, but despite all efforts, he lost his eye. He tried to sue us, the grinder manufacturer, the disc manufacturer, and even Home Depot, where the grinder was bought. But with his inch-thick file of write-ups, he didn't have a strong case. Ironically, he was arrested before the trial. His neighbor called animal control, claiming Patch the Pirate was running a dogfighting ring. The police arrived and found him in the act of beating a dog. They discovered dozens of malnourished, abused dogs chained in his yard. He ended up in prison and his civil case was dismissed. Story 28. I guess you could call it work. I was deployed with the army to the middle of nowhere in Afghanistan. We saw semi-regular combat and a lot of the grim realities that come with it. One incident that stood out was a firefight near a village. It wasn't close quarters, more like both sides exchanging shots from hundreds of yards away, with neither side being very accurate. In the middle of it, we noticed kids coming out of houses, swarming our vehicles. Bullets were kicking up dust everywhere, but these kids were picking up spent brass casings to sell. Even more disturbing, we saw parents standing in doorways, directing the kids toward the vehicles with larger guns for more valuable brass. These parents were sending their kids into an active firefight to collect brass while they stayed inside. We were trained to understand cultural differences, particularly the concept of fatalism. But it was shocking to see parents embrace that philosophy only when it meant risking their kids' lives, not their own. We left the area once we realized what was happening. It was a deeply disappointing experience that left me feeling disheartened by humanity. Story 29. Former EMT here. I once took a woman to see an ENT. He came in and abruptly shoved an instrument into the stoma in her neck without warning. Then he pulled it out and shoved it up her nose. The woman was shaking and crying. The doctor told us to hold her down, but I refused, shocked at what he was doing. He hadn't given any warning or even cleaned the instrument between uses. It was nauseating. In a different incident, a pregnant woman was being beaten by her boyfriend outside the hospital. My partner and I separated them and got her inside, calling for help. It took my partner physically approaching security to get them to intervene. The boyfriend followed us inside, threatening violence, trying to drag her back out. I stood between him and her, making it clear he wouldn't get past me. The entire lobby, security and staff included, had watched her get attacked outside and did nothing. If we hadn't stepped in, no one would have helped. They eventually kicked him out, but it was far too late. Story 30. I worked as a shift supervisor at a certain coffee shop. My manager, 40F, told me to give a specific guy our employee discount. I didn't question it, assuming he was a relative. One night, I was closing. After a long day, I got halfway home before realizing I'd left my phone behind. I turned around to retrieve it. When I got back, I noticed the storage area lights were still on. As I approached, I heard noises and soon saw my manager bent over, engaging in explicit activities with the young man. I slowly backed away, grabbed my phone from the counter, and left. I requested a transfer later that week. I don't think she ever saw me. I found out through Facebook that the teenager was actually a 19-year-old college student she was having an affair with. Story 31. A guy and a girl were dating but decided to mutually separate. The girl changed apartments and started dating someone else for almost 6 months. Her ex-boyfriend asked a different girl out to lunch, and she got angry. She came up behind him at work with a box cutter blade, attempting to cut his side, presumably aiming to scratch him. Luckily, he was wearing an undershirt and a shirt, so the blade didn't cut him, but he felt the snag. When he turned to see what it was, she aimed to cut his arm. The razor blade ended up slicing his forearm deeply, like butterflying a pork chop. To make things worse, this guy was a manual staple gun operator, bodybuilder, and bouncer. His jacked arms made the injury look like a 6-inch thick pork chop had been split. No one on the line would speak up about what happened, as the snitches get stitches mentality ran deep among the workers. Security footage eventually revealed the truth. Another incident involved a worker operating a giant cross-cut saw. If trim cuts were less than 1/2 inch, the material could fall into the gap, triggering the homing laser to stop the motor and prevent damage. Proper lockout-tagout, LOTO, took time, so operators often bypassed it despite training. One day, maintenance opened an access panel to press the rehoming button and clear material, using a 3-foot screwdriver to avoid getting inside the machine. The operator observed and learned how to replicate the process. The operator worked third shift, which was mostly maintenance staff and a few operators running critical machines. On the day of the incident, I arrived early for a quality training session at 7 a.m. I got there at 5 a.m. Maintenance had finished early and left, assuming there was only about 30 minutes of work left. Just as I was about to clock in, the operator ran up to me for help. He showed me his hand, slinging blood 3 feet across the ground, up the wall, and even onto the ceiling. Covered in blood, I saw the trail leading from the back of the plant to the front. I tried calling the plant manager and safety manager, but no one answered. I wrapped the guy's hand, put him in my car, and drove to the hospital 5 minutes away. The rest of the plant arrived at 6:45 a.m. to a scene that looked like a murder, with blood trailing from the back to the front wall and then to the parking lot. Here's what happened. A stoppage occurred right after maintenance left. The operator found a screwdriver, removed the access panel, and leaned in to press the button. The motor and the housing were only 1/4 inch apart, and he had his hand bracing against the side. When he pressed the button, the motor rehomed instantly, crushing his hand against the machine. He pulled his hand out, degloving it from 3 inches above the wrist to the second knuckles. Fortunately, the skin remained attached, but it looked like pulling a latex glove off to the fingertips. His bones were crushed, and his hand was floppy, like silicone. Doctors managed to save the hand with a significant number of pins and rods, and 6 months later, he returned to work. Our safety program received a massive overhaul afterward, changes I had been documenting and requesting for years. Story 32. I worked in pest control for 3 years. I saw a lot of unpleasant things, both literally and figuratively. The way some people choose to live is truly baffling. The one job that sticks with me the most happened in the middle of August during a record-breaking heat wave. I had to crawl through a very small entrance to remove a dead raccoon that had been there for about 2-3 weeks. By then, the raccoon was mostly decomposed, just liquid, tufts of fur, skin, and bones. The crawl space entrance was so small that I could only fit one arm and my torso in at a time. I wore a full respirator, but squeezing through the entrance kept knocking it off my face, exposing me to the horrific stench of the decaying raccoon. I couldn't stay inside for more than a few minutes at a time. The raccoon was about 10 feet away, so I had to stretch my arm as far as possible to scoop pieces of it with a shovel and rake. The entire job took about an hour, as I had to stop and dry heave every time I exited the crawl space. I left with a $150 check, from which I earned maybe $10 in commission. After showering and cleaning my uniform, I enrolled in college that same day. I've happily been working in IT ever since. Story 33. I worked at a casino once. A son and his elderly mother came in. She had mobility issues. At some point, she needed to use the restroom, but her son wouldn't help her, and she ended up wetting herself. She was incredibly embarrassed. I helped her to the bathroom, wrapping her jacket around her waist. For some reason, this moment has always haunted me. I also worked at a seedy hotel. One night, a young woman and a man were having money troubles and couldn't get a room. They sat in their truck outside the lobby, and a domestic argument seemed to start. The man left, and the woman tried to camp out in the lobby. She was clearly on drugs and became argumentative when I asked her to leave, but eventually she did. Later, she returned with no pants or shoes. I got a call from one of the rooms, saying they'd had to kick her out after she tried to shoot up. She had convinced someone to let her in, but quickly wore out her welcome. I had to convince the 19-year-old woman to gather her belongings and get dressed. Eventually, she was arrested. Story 34. I didn't witness this event, but it was one of the most tragic I'd ever heard of. One of the brightest medical students at Edinburgh University, in her final year and just months from graduation, got her bike wheel stuck in a tram line and fell. Her head was crushed by a tourist minibus. The news devastated the staff, and it affected me deeply, as I had conducted census checks for her in the past. Her family had already booked flights from Hong Kong and graduation tickets. The family's heartbreak must have been unimaginable, losing their daughter who was so close to becoming a doctor after years of high tuition fees and dedication. At the graduation ceremony, the university reimbursed the family for their flights and accommodation, giving them front row seats. The student was posthumously awarded her degree, along with an Academic Excellence Award, which her brother collected on stage. The standing ovation lasted about 5 minutes, with many professors, colleagues, and even strangers tearing up. It was the saddest ceremony I've ever experienced. Story 35. My boss, when I worked at Moe's Southwest Grill, was awesome, but also a bit unhinged. He was a retired surfing instructor from Hawaii who had moved to the mountains to follow his ex-wife, who was trying to keep his kids away from him. One day, a homeless man, clearly on drugs, came in during the midday lull and pulled a rusty shiv on me, demanding all the cash from the register if I wanted to live. The register was in full view of my boss's one-way mirror, and I caught a glimpse of him sprinting out the back door. As I emptied the register and tried to keep my distance from the man, my boss came charging in through the side door, wielding a baseball bat. He swung it at the man's leg with enough force to bend it the wrong way. The man fell, waving his knife, so my boss sprayed him in the eyes with wasp spray. He then pulled out his self-defense hatchet, wrestled the knife away, and threatened to scalp the man if he didn't surrender. I called the cops, who arrived quickly and took control of the situation before my boss could do anything else. After they left, my boss said, "If he had a gun, I would have splattered the counter with his brains. It's our word against the corpses, and you're more important than the cash." He then hugged me, handed me a beer, and returned to his office to put his bat, gun, and hatchet away. I was in shock. I never saw him do anything like that again, but he always remained a bit unstable. He was loyal and a good friend, but his extreme willingness to kill was surprising for someone who had never been in the military. Story 36. It was preseason lifeguard recertification before the pool opened for summer. Around 18 lifeguards were lined up around a filling pool, practicing CPR on dummies, when suddenly a man slammed against the tall fence and shouted, "Someone collapsed!" We all ran to the tennis club, where an overweight man in his 50s lay unconscious on the court, soaked in sweat. The club didn't have an AED, but our CPR instructor had one in his car. 5 of us, including me, assisted in CPR. I alternated compressions while someone gave breaths, and 2 others prepared the AED. Cutting open his shirt was tough, and I eventually ripped it apart after struggling with the angle. The AED was attached and a shock was delivered. The man arched off the ground, supported only by his head and feet, then fell back down. He moaned loudly and gasped as he landed. His eyes opened and he began breathing again. 2 minutes later, the fire department arrived and took him to the hospital. The sight of him lifting off the ground looked almost demonic, and the memory still freaks me out. The man was wealthy and gave us 5 tickets to the Rogers Cup. I didn't go, as someone else on staff liked tennis more. Story 37. Compared to others, my story is mild, but it still angers me. I was the second teacher for the school's girls' volleyball club, and the head coach was extremely harsh. She clearly had psychological issues, but those often go ignored in Japan. If she disliked a player, it was over for them. One student, who had just returned from a study abroad program, had less practice than her peers. The coach criticized her for every small mistake, once berating her for half an hour over her stance while receiving the ball. With the third-year students retiring, this girl became captain, leading a team of mostly inexperienced players. The coach's abuse worsened, and the new captain struggled under the pressure. During one game, she sprained her ankle badly but insisted on playing to avoid further abuse. Eventually, she took a 6-month leave from school due to mental health issues. When she returned, she was just a shell of her former self. I reported the coach several times, as did the parents, but I was a new teacher, and the coach was a longtime award-winning volleyball player. After the incident details surfaced, she was suspended for a year and then transferred to another school. I don't know if she harmed anyone else afterward. This happened when I was recovering from my own anxiety disorder, so I related deeply to the student. The coach's actions still upset me, as they ruined a bright, cheerful girl's life over trivial matters. Story 38. I worked summer night shifts at a sawmill. The easiest job was also the most boring, standing on a walkway 60 feet high, watching wood pass by. There was a red button that shut down a large gear when wood shifted between chains in the sorter. I was relieved from this task to stack wood, and a temp worker took over. As I returned, I saw him fixing something on a girder. He backed off, missed a step, fell, hit his legs, and then smashed his head on the ground. Another employee and I had to hold him down as he tried to get up like a zombie, his head swollen. After the ambulance took him away, we were told to make up for the downtime caused by holding down a dying coworker. The next day, we got a 5-minute safety briefing, during which the foreman let slip his relief that the temp worker was just a temp. I was 19 years old. Story 39. When I worked in retail, I started my shift at 6 a.m. to put away deliveries, which meant waiting outside for the delivery driver. One day, while waiting outside, I noticed a man I'd never seen before. He was soaking wet, not just rained on, but like he'd been in the bath with all his clothes on. I greeted him and asked if he was okay. He just smiled and said, "Yeah, mate." He stood outside the store for 3 hours, waiting for us to open, still soaking wet in the cold. I live in the northwest of England, a seaside town, so it gets really cold. I went back out to him and asked again if he was okay. He still just said, "Yeah, mate." I suggested he wait in the McDonald's across the road, where it was warm and he could get some food. At 9 a.m., the manager opened the door, and the man, still there, entered the store and bought a Stanley knife and a pair of socks. He then went around to the alley next to the store, where he began stabbing himself in the neck with the knife. The security guard and I, suspecting something was off with his purchase, went to check on him and found him in the alley. Luckily, a paramedic happened to be driving by on the promenade, and the security guard waved them down. 2 days later, we learned the full story. The man had recently been discharged from the Harbor, a local mental health hospital, and was severely depressed. He had attempted to drown himself in the sea, but couldn't go through with it, which explained why he was so wet. I'm not sure what happened to him afterward, but I think about it every now and then. Story 40. I used to work at a micro center. I was at the returns desk one day when a man came in with a shopping cart carrying a pre-built PC that looked like it had been in a serious fire. He handed me a receipt for the parts, which were from a custom-built PC worth about $2,300. As soon as he started talking, I could tell he was not in a good mental state. He was unhinged and had an intimidating presence. He was about 6'8" and towered over the counter. I took one look at the melted pile of computer parts and told him there was no way we could accept the return. It was barely recognizable as a PC. He then started pounding his fists on the counter, screaming, "I am going to kill everybody in this place," repeating it 4 or 5 times at the top of his lungs. Customers around him began sprinting out of the store. I was stunned. I'd never experienced anything like that before. I was 17, and this was my first real job. I immediately ran into the back, where the supervisor was hiding, having heard the shouting. Without hesitation, the supervisor told me to refund the man's entire order to get him out of the store. We ended up giving him back $2,300 in cash for a cart full of burnt computer parts. Story 41. I work at a veterinary hospital. A French bulldog came in for a C-section, common for bulldogs, as they often need surgical help to give birth. Sadly, the mother dog died during the surgery. Smooshy face breeds like bulldogs are always at higher risk under anesthesia or during post-op. The puppies survived, but the breeders didn't seem to care about the mother's death. They were only excited about the puppies. They had several other pregnant French bulldogs at home anyway. Since the mother's milk is vital for the puppies, I had to watch my coworkers try to get the newborns to latch on to their deceased mother. In another case, a young Chihuahua, barely a year old, was bred. It's like a human child becoming pregnant. She had only one puppy, delivered by C-section. The Chihuahua never woke up from surgery. An unexpected complication left her brain dead, and the owners had to come see her while she was still on life support. 2 young owners, probably in their early 20s, arrived. They held the puppy while looking at the mother, not shedding a tear. I couldn't tell if they were in shock or if it hadn't sunk in yet, but it was a sad scene. The mother dog was eventually put to sleep. Story 42. I picked up a phone call at the bar, and they asked to speak to the new owner. I handed him the phone. While I stood nearby polishing glasses, I suddenly heard him exclaim, "Wait, what?" I looked over, and his face was contorted in the most bizarre way. He hung up and walked away. I continued polishing glasses, but something felt off. With the bar under control, I quietly made my way to the office, knocked on the door, and went in. He was sitting in his big office chair, facing the security screens, with his back to me. I asked, "Hey man, is everything okay?" He spun around in his chair, his face red and tear-streaked, filled with raw grief. He cried, "He's dead! My boy is dead!" His son worked in the mines in Western Australia. The previous day, he'd received an electric shock, not severe enough to incapacitate him, but enough to make him alert. He had gone straight home that night without seeking medical attention. When he didn't show up for work the next day, his co-workers came to check on him and found him on the couch, eyes open, holding a beer, with the TV on. He had just sat down, cracked open a beer, and died. I watched a man receive the news that his only son had been found dead, and I was the first person he told. Witnessing a man's soul shatter like that was deeply affecting. Story 43. I was a kennel tech at a vet clinic a few years ago, and I have 2 stories. One involved a dachshund that had been grabbed by a larger dog at the park and shaken violently. Fortunately, his spine wasn't broken, and we stabilized him with surgery. A few days later, he returned needing another surgery, as the skin on his back had become necrotic or infected. During recovery, despite heavy pain meds, he squirmed in a way that reopened a blood vessel, forcing us to stitch it closed without sedation. He eventually recovered, and we saw him regularly for bandage changes until he was stable enough to be cared for at home. Another case involved a dog in recovery, breathing strangely. When I asked a nurse about it, she said, "They just do that sometimes when waking up from surgery." After I swapped her blanket for a warm one from the dryer, I noticed her gums were bone white, with blood leaking from the incision. I called for the nurse, and she and the vet rushed to get her back on the table, but it was too late. She had bled out internally. She had been heavily pregnant, but the owner insisted on a spay. Since she was so far along, the blood supply to her uterus was large, and one of the vessels reopened post-surgery. Story 44. I was a resident assistant for first-year college students for 2.5 years, starting in 2020. It wasn't one specific incident, but a pattern of intense burnout that stood out. 18 and 19-year-olds shouldn't be feeling like their lives are worthless, but I saw it often. I was assigned to an honors hall, but this pressure wasn't unique to those students. They felt immense pressure to be normal while navigating an isolating and traumatic period. I'm now a psych PhD student, and one of my research areas is eating behaviors. I came across an old data set that hadn't been analyzed, with open-ended questions about negative eating experiences. Some responses were heartbreaking, accounts of food deprivation as punishment, eating disorders, and the events that led to them. It's devastating because the data is fully anonymized, and even if it weren't, there's nothing I could do without breaking confidentiality. I often wonder about those people and hope they found the help they needed. Story 45. I have several stories from my time as a police officer, but here's one that stands out. I've seen disturbing things daily. Drug addicts injuring themselves, attempted suicides, severe vehicle accidents, and gruesome murders. One case involved a young woman who had just turned 18. She'd never experienced mental illness before, according to her parents. I cleared the call with another officer when it came through. The dispatcher reported that the young woman was in her bedroom, in the dark, wearing her mother's wedding dress and holding a butcher knife. She was kneeling in the center of the room. We convinced her to put down the knife, which she handed to her parents. She alternated between hysterical laughter and a blank, 1,000-yard stare. Toxicology reports came back clean. She had no drugs in her system and was physically healthy. While my partner spoke to the parents, I stayed with the daughter. I tried to engage her, but she wouldn't respond. Suddenly, she reached up, dug her fingers into her right eye socket, and plucked out her eye. I immediately radioed for an ambulance. But before the call could go out, she crushed the eye in her hand while laughing. She was taken to a mental health facility and, of course, lost the eye. I have no idea what happened to her after that, but I hope she received the help she needed. Story 46. I used to be a gymnastics coach, around 20 years old at the time. Another coach and I were running a Saturday morning preschool class with kids aged 3, 5. We would set up stations and drills for the kids, along with a fun obstacle course for the end of the class. Since it was Saturday morning and no other classes were happening, we had access to plenty of mats, making the course very padded and safe. This particular course had a low balance beam at the end, surrounded by mats on all sides, essentially baby-proof. The kids went around the course for about 10 minutes. On the very last turn, a nearly 5-year-old girl was walking on the beam. She got distracted and stepped off, somehow missing every mat and hitting her forehead on the edge of a low window nearby. I saw it all happen in slow motion. Her forehead split open from the top of her nose to her scalp, with blood gushing quickly. I ran to her, carried her to the front, and called an ambulance immediately. Her mother was upstairs in the viewing area and hadn't seen it happen. When she came downstairs, I was holding her daughter, both of us covered in blood. She went into full panic mode, and the other coach tried to calm her while we waited for the ambulance. I was terrified the girl would lose too much blood. The girl was ultimately fine. She got about 20 stitches. She and her mother returned for class a few months later. Story 47. We had a guy apply for a job that required a criminal background check. He assured us there was nothing on it, but the report showed he had served time for SA of a child. When I called to tell him we had to withdraw the offer, he seemed genuinely shocked by the report. I advised him to contact the police if it was inaccurate. It then became clear he wasn't denying the conviction, but genuinely didn't understand why it was considered wrong. Another story was when I worked in an office overlooking a train station. High-speed trains often passed through without stopping. One day, we saw a lot of police activity in an air ambulance at the station. Curious, we looked out and saw that someone had thrown themselves under a high-speed train. That image haunted my nightmares for years. Story 48. I worked moving drilling rigs from early 2017 to early 2019 after dropping out of college. Moving a drilling rig involves heavy equipment and requires patience, making it a very dangerous job. I operated a pole truck, a semi-truck with poles and winch lines on the bed. One weekend, I got called to help on a job site. I didn't want to go, but double-time pay made the decision for me. When I arrived, I saw a flatbed semi with a rig motor, weighing about 90,000 pounds on its side. As I got closer, I noticed a man trapped underneath, crushed from the waist down but still alive. I asked why an ambulance hadn't been called, and the workers explained that he was an undocumented immigrant, so they feared repercussions. I used my pole truck to lift the semi off him, then left the site to call an ambulance. I didn't realize until then that a body could be so flattened. Story 49. We hired a new lady who was late on her first day. I was training her and could tell she had a lot going on, Her father had passed away, her child was struggling with her working, and she was a single mom. So I let the lateness slide. However, she was late 3 days in a row, and by the third day, she smelled like cat urine. Another employee accused her of drinking on the job, but I assumed it was just annoyance with the newbie. Later, I sat beside her and heard the distinct sound of a metal cap being unscrewed from a glass bottle, followed by pouring into her mug. I stood up calmly, walked behind her, and saw her using a $200 bottle of rum we kept in the boardroom for special occasions. We worked in a law office, so I had to report her to a partner. He called her into his office and she admitted she was an alcoholic. She was terminated, but we referred her to rehab programs. She left in tears. Story 50. I was the lead programmer on a U.S. military training application over 25 years ago, working on video and graphics simulations with an open development architecture for integrating other team components. It was a $30 million contract, developed on Windows NT 3.5. We were nearly done, with just a few glitches left, when the customer requested a switch to NT 4.0. I showed the boss that it worked perfectly with a simple compiler option, a single checkbox. However, the company tried to play hardball, demanding full payment for the NT 3.5 version, while bidding another $30 million for the NT 4.0 upgrade. I pointed out that the specs clearly explained all the tech involved, and it was obvious the change was a simple checkbox flip. 2 months of negotiations followed, during which I was labeled a troublemaker for voicing concerns. I eventually left the company. A year later, the company was charged with fraud over another project and shut down. I still work at the company I moved to afterward, which won several awards for being a top IT workplace.